The arrow that should have killed Seth Sutton missed his throat by the width of a coin, and he owed his life to the fact that someone else's arrow struck the bowman first. He did not see her yet. He only heard the wet gasp of the man who had been drawing on him from the alder thicket, saw the fellow pitch sideways off the deadfall he'd been crouched behind, and felt the world tilt as his own knees buckled from the shock of nearly dying. Seth dropped low on instinct, huntsman's instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 11 winters of running Lord Ashcombe's traplines along the frontier woods. He had a skinning knife in his belt and a longbow in his hand, and neither had been fast enough. Someone else's had. He scanned the tree line, heart slamming, and that was when he saw her for the first time, a shape unfolding out of the shadows between two black pines like the forest itself deciding to stand up and walk. She was tall enough to meet his eyes without lifting her chin, which was already unusual, because Seth stood a full head above most men in the border villages. Her skin was a deep mossy green, weathered like old bronze, and her black hair was bound back in a single thick braid threaded with small bone beads that clicked faintly as she moved. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and supple, laced snug up the sides so they hugged the strong lines of her body without a wasted inch of cloth, a leather cuirass molded close over her chest, and cinched at a waist that curved sharply before flaring to powerful hips, and knee-high boots scarred pale with old use. A short recurve bow was still raised in her hand, an arrow already nocked for a second shot that would not be needed, and her tusks, not over-large, more elegant than brutish, caught the gray afternoon light when her lips parted. "Do not move," she said, in a voice low and rough as river stone, her common tongue accented but clear. There were two. Seth froze. His whole body understood the command in a way his pride did not like. A second man broke from the brush 30 paces off, a short sword raised, and the orc woman turned with a fluid economy of motion that made the movement look almost lazy, drew, loosed, and put the arrow through the meat of the man's shoulder before he had covered 10 steps. He screamed and fell and did not get up again, clutching himself, and she was already stalking toward him with the unhurried confidence of a predator who knew the chase was already over. "Tax men," Seth breathed, recognizing the studded leather jerkins now that he could see them clearly, the black and red sash of warlord Kestrel Voss's collectors. "They've been sweeping the frontier farms for 3 weeks. Christ, they tried to kill me over a hunting fee. They tried to kill you because you would not pay it," the orc woman said without turning, standing over the wounded collector with her bow still drawn on him, "and because a dead man cannot complain to the Lord he answers to." She looked back at Seth over her shoulder, and something in her yellow eyes moved across him slowly, assessing, the way a woman might weigh a blade before buying it. "You are the huntsman." Sutton, it was not a question, and that unsettled him more than the arrow had. "How do you know my name?" She did not answer. She crouched instead and pulled a strip of leather from her own belt to bind the moaning tax collector's wrists, efficient and rough, ignoring his whimpering, and then straightened and regarded Seth again with that same unreadable weight in her stare. "Go home, huntsman Sutton," she said. "Tell no one what you saw here. If Voss's men learn an orc walks this wood, they will burn it looking for her." "I'm not going to just walk away and leave you standing over 2 of Voss's men with arrows in them," Seth said, and even as the words left his mouth he heard how foolish they sounded. A lone huntsman lecturing a warrior who had just saved his life twice in the span of a breath. But he meant it. He had never been a man who could simply walk away from trouble that concerned him, and something about the calm way she'd said "tell no one," as though she expected to vanish back into the trees and never be thought of again, needled at him. "You will," she said, and there was the ghost of something almost like amusement at the corner of her mouth, quickly buried. "Because if you do not, I will put the next arrow somewhere less kind than his shoulder." Seth looked at the fallen bowman, unmoving in the leaf litter, definitely dead, and at the wounded collector groaning at her feet, and understood with sudden clarity that she was not joking about her aim. "What's your name?" He asked instead because it seemed in that strange suspended moment the only question that mattered. She studied him a long moment, weighing whether to answer at all. "Glasha," she said finally. "Glasha Doomhammer." "Well," Seth said, still breathing hard, still feeling the ghost heat of the arrow that had passed him by. "Thank you, Glasha Doomhammer." "Do not thank me yet, huntsman," she said, already turning to melt back into the tree line, bow still in hand, leaving the bound collector groaning behind her. "You do not yet know what you owe." And then she was gone, swallowed by shadow and pine, and Seth Sutton stood alone in the clearing with a dead man, a wounded man, and a feeling in his chest he could not name, like a door had opened somewhere inside him that he had long ago nailed shut. He told no one. He hauled the wounded collector to the border road himself, dragging him by the collar on a hide sledge more roughly than strictly necessary, and left him where a passing wagon would find him. And he buried the dead one beneath river stones because even a tax man deserved that much. And that night in the small log cabin at the edge of Lord Ashcombe's forest holding, he lay awake and thought of yellow eyes weighing him like a blade worth buying, and did not sleep for a long while. What Seth Sutton did not know, could not have known, was that Glasha Doomhammer had not simply happened upon him in that clearing by chance. She had been sent. 3 weeks earlier, in the war camp of the Ashwood clan deep in the northern hills where the pines grew black and ancient, and no human road had ever been cut, the clan's war chief Gromesh Ironjaw had stood before his gathered captains with a strip of tanned hide marked in charcoal, a rough map of the frontier's edge. "The tax warlord Voss grows bold," Gromesh had said, his voice a grinding boulder of a thing that silenced the fire-pit chatter of 24 warriors. "His collectors push past the old boundary stones. They burn crofts that cannot pay. If he pushes further, he pushes into our hunting grounds, and then it is war, whether we choose it or not." He had turned his heavy-browed gaze across the gathered faces until it landed, as it always seemed to, on the one warrior who could out-hunt, out-track, and outshoot every other scout the clan possessed. "Glasha Doomhammer, you will go to the edge of our territory, to the human forest they call Ashcombe's Wood. There is a huntsman there, a man who works alone and knows every deer trail and hidden stream in that country better than any other living soul. Watch him. Learn if he serves this Voss or resists him. Learn if the humans of that wood will fight when the tax warlord comes for their land, as he will. Report back what you see, so the clan may know whether to prepare for war or wait." Glasha had taken the charge without complaint, because that was what she did. She was, by acclaim of every captain in the Ashwood clan, their deadliest scout, a woman who had tracked raiders through blizzards and crossed enemy lines without a single footprint to mark her passage, who had killed more men in ambush than any 2 warriors combined, and who had never once failed a task given to her. She expected this to be no different. Watch a human huntsman. Learn what he was worth. Report back. She had not expected, on the very first day she found him, to watch 2 of the tax warlord's men draw down on him from ambush, and she had not expected the swiftness with which her body had moved to stop them before her mind had finished deciding to. She told herself afterward, crouched in a high pine with the huntsman's cabin lit gold below her in the dusk, that she had only acted to protect a source of intelligence. A dead huntsman could tell the clan nothing. That was all. That was the whole of it. It was not the whole of it, and some small, unfamiliar, unwelcome part of her already knew that. She watched him for 11 days before he ever saw her again. She watched him check his trap lines at dawn with the patient, unhurried care of a man who respected the animals he killed, resetting snares with clean hands, murmuring low words of thanks over the rabbits and martens he took, as though some old forest custom lived in him that most humans had long forgotten. She watched him split wood in the yard behind his cabin with his shirt off in the autumn chill, muscle moving under skin scarred by old work, and told herself the tightening low in her belly was simple appreciation of a strong body, nothing more, the way a warrior appreciates a good horse. She watched him ride into the border village of Milro once a week with furs to trade, watched him speak gently to the miller's frightened daughter when Voss's collectors harangued the girl over a debt her dead father had left, watched him quietly pay the debt himself from his own thin purse without being asked, without expecting thanks, and ride away before the girl could even find words. She watched him sit alone by his fire most nights, a solitary man in a solitary cabin at the edge of a dangerous wood, and something in the set of his shoulders when he thought no one watched spoke a language Glasha understood too well from her own long nights in the war camp surrounded by clanfolk who respected her, feared her, and did not truly know her. Loneliness had its own shape, whether carved into orc or human. She recognized it in him the way she might recognize a trail she herself had walked. By the 11th day she had stopped writing her reports. She had begun 3 of them. Each time she had sat with a scraped hide and a stick of burned charcoal, meaning to set down what she had learned. The huntsman resists the tax warlord's men. The humans of this wood will fight if pressed. Recommend the clan prepare alliance or war true things, useful things, the things Gramesh Ironjaw needed to know. And each time she had found herself instead sketching, without meaning to, the line of Seth Sutton's jaw as he laughed at some joke of his own making while mending a fence, or the particular way his hands moved when he was gentle with something small and frightened. She had burned each attempt in her own small fire rather than let another scout find them. This was not watching for the clan any longer. She knew that now, crouched in her hidden blind above his cabin on the 11th night, watching lamplight move behind his shuttered window. This was something else, something that had no proper orc word for it, that did not sound like weakness, and yet did not feel like weakness at all. It felt like the first true thing she had wanted for herself in a very long, hard life of wanting nothing but the clan's survival. She told herself she would make contact once more, only once, to be certain her judgment had not gone soft, and then she would decide. The second meeting was not an ambush. It was, to Glasha's own private irritation, something closer to nerves. She found him at the river ford 3 miles east of his cabin, kneeling in the shallows checking a fish weir he had built from woven willow branches, his boots and coat set neatly on the bank, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. The autumn water was cold enough to numb a man's hands in minutes, and Seth was cursing softly under his breath at a knot that would not give when Glasha simply stepped out from the alder brush onto the bank, as though she had every right to be there. Seth's head came up fast, water dripping from his forearms, and for one heartbeat something like fear flickered across his face before recognition replaced it. "You," he said, and did not sound frightened anymore, which surprised her. He sounded, if anything, glad. "I thought I imagined you." "I do not think men imagine things with arrows," Glasha said, and let herself settle onto a flat stone at the water's edge, close enough that the hem of her leathers nearly touched the river. Up close in daylight, she could see the fine details she had denied herself at a distance. The weather lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into forest light for years, the honest calluses on his hands, the steady, unafraid way he held her gaze even now, knowing what she was and what she had done to 2 of Voss's men without visible remorse. Fair point. He waded to the bank and sat, not too close, pulling his boots back on with unhurried care, giving her time, she realized, to decide whether she wanted him closer or not. It was a small courtesy. It struck her harder than she expected. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted, plainly. The way she was coming to understand was simply his nature. He did not seem to know how to be anything but honest, which in her experience of humans was a rare and almost foolish trait. "Wondering if you were even real or some spirit of the wood come to spare me for reasons of your own." "I am no spirit," Glasha said. "I am Ashwood clan. Our territory borders this wood to the north." "I know the borders," Seth said. "Lord Ashcombe's father signed a treaty with your clan 30 years back. Nobody's crossed it in my lifetime, not from either side. Not until you." "I crossed it to watch you," Glasha said, and the admission cost her more than she expected it to. some old instinct screaming at her to guard her purpose the way she guarded her back in a fight. My war chief sent me to learn if the humans of this wood would resist the tax warlord Voss or bow to him, to learn if there would be war on our border or peace. Seth absorbed this with the same steady calm he seemed to bring to everything. And what have you learned? That you pay other men's debts you cannot afford, Glasha said, and speak gently to frightened girls, and bury men who tried to kill you rather than leave them for crows, and sit alone by your fire most nights with no one to share it. She watched his face carefully as she said it, saw the faint startle in his eyes at how closely she had watched him, and did not look away from it. I have learned that you are a good man in a hard country, Huntsman Sutton, and I do not know yet what my clan should do with that information. Seth was quiet a moment, the river running past them both, cold and clean, and indifferent to the weight of what had just passed between them. Are you going to keep watching me? He asked finally, and there was something underneath the question, some careful hope he was trying not to let show and failing. Yes, Glasha said simply, because she had decided, sitting there in the cold autumn light with the water running past, that she was done pretending otherwise even to herself. I am going to keep watching you, Seth Sutton. I find that I do not wish to stop. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his ordinary, weathered, unremarkable face transformed, opened, the way a shuttered window opens to let in unexpected sun. Then you might as well stop hiding in the trees, he said, and come sit by my fire instead. I make terrible stew, but I've got enough for two, and I would rather have the company of a woman who's saved my life twice than not. It was, Glasha thought, the single most reckless invitation any creature had ever extended to her, a human huntsman inviting an orc scout of an enemy clan into his home, as though she were simply a neighbor come to call. And she found herself smiling despite every instinct that told her smiling was a weakness she could not afford. Your stew had better be terrible, she said, rising, so I have something honest to complain about. And she followed him back through the darkening wood toward his cabin, no longer bothering to hide her footprints. Word of the tax warlord's cruelty reached the border villages faster than autumn frost that year. Kestrel Voss held his seat of power in the walled market town of Harrow's Cross, a squat stone keep with a black banner, and his collectors ranged the frontier with growing boldness, levying fees on hunting, on milling, on marriage, on burial, fees invented faster than farmers could pay them, backed by armed men who did not hesitate to burn a barn or break a door to collect. Lord Ashcombe, whose lands bordered Voss's on the frontier's edge, was an aging man more concerned with his hunting hounds than his tenants' suffering, and had done nothing to stop it, which left men like Seth Sutton, a huntsman who answered to no lord's daily command, free to roam the deep woods on his own authority, as one of the few figures in the region who moved freely enough, and was trusted enough by the small farms scattered through the trees, to matter at all. Glasha came to understand this over the following weeks, as her visits to Seth's cabin became something less like surveillance and something closer, dangerously, to homecoming. She sat across his hearth while he told her, plainly and without exaggeration, what he saw on his weekly trips to Milrow, which farms Voss's men had squeezed dry, which widow had been threatened with eviction over a fee she could not pay, which old man had been beaten for arguing over a grain tax that hadn't existed the season before. She began to understand that Seth was not merely a good man watching bad things happen. He was, in his quiet way, already resisting paying debts he could not afford, hiding grain for families who would otherwise starve through winter, once even standing physically between a collector's raised cudgel and a farmer's son, until the collector, unnerved by the huntsman's size and the flat, dangerous calm in his eyes, had backed down. You could be killed for that, Glasha told him one night, sharper than she meant to, fear making her voice hard, as he recounted the incident over a shared bowl of stew that was, true to his warning, genuinely terrible. Could have been killed a lot of ways already, Seth said, unbothered. including by an arrow if a certain orc scout hadn't decided my throat was worth saving. He looked at her over the fire, and something in his gaze had shifted in the weeks since the river grown warmer, bolder, less careful of hiding what it wanted. Why do you care so much whether I'm killed, Glasha? You could report to your war chief that the humans of this wood are weak and divided, and let Voss burn us all down without lifting a finger. Simplest thing in the world for you. I have not sent a single report to my war chief, Glasha said, and the admission, spoken aloud for the first time, felt like stepping off a cliff she had been circling for a month. Not since the day I met you. Gramesh believes I am still watching and weighing. In truth, I have simply been. She struggled for the word, found none in common tongue that satisfied her, and switched briefly to her own harsh, guttural clan speech before catching herself and returning. I have simply been with you. And I find I do not want to stop being with you long enough to write down what it means. Seth set down his bowl slowly. The fire popped and settled between them, throwing gold light across the strong green planes of her face, the tusks that no longer struck him as fearsome but simply as hers, part of the whole magnificent, terrifying, beloved shape of her. Glasha, he said low, and reached across the small space between them to touch her hand where it rested on her knee, the first time he had dared to touch her at all, and she did not pull away. I have been alone in these woods a long time. Long enough I stopped expecting anything different. I don't know what I am to you, or what you risk by sitting here instead of reporting back to your clan. But I know I have never in my life wanted a woman's company the way I want yours, and I am done pretending otherwise just because it frightens me. It should frighten you, Glasha said, but her fingers turned beneath his, threading through them, green against sun-browned skin, a small fierce claiming she made without quite meaning to. I am orc. My clan and yours have shed blood across this border for generations. My own war chief would call this madness if he knew. Yours would call it worse. Don't much care what either of them would call it, Seth said, and lifted her hand to press his mouth against her knuckles, rough with old scars, warrior's hands, and felt her breath catch audibly in the quiet cabin. I only care what you call it. Glasha looked at him a long moment, yellow eyes bright in the firelight, some old wall inside her cracking audibly even to herself. I call it dangerous, she said finally, voice gone rough and low, and leaned across the space between them to press her mouth to his, not gentle, not careful, but hungry and sure. A warrior's decisiveness poured into the single act of finally taking what she had denied herself for weeks, and felt him respond with a fierceness that startled her, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her skull as though she were something precious rather than something dangerous, or perhaps, she thought dimly as the kiss deepened. Both at once. I call it dangerous, she said again when they finally broke apart, breathless, foreheads pressed together, and I do not intend to stop. Winter closed over the frontier wood like a fist, and with it came Kestrel Voss's cruelty in earnest. The tax warlord, emboldened by a mild autumn harvest and Lord Ashcombe's continued indifference, doubled his levies as the first snows fell, sending armed collectors into every crofter's yard along the wood's edge with demands no family could meet. Glasha, who by midwinter spent more nights in Seth's cabin than in any hidden blind in the trees, watched him grow grimmer with each trip to Milrow, watched the careful control he kept over his own anger fray a little more, with every story of a family turned out into the snow. They took the Halloran's last milk cow, he told her one bitter evening, stamping snow from his boots inside the cabin door, his face raw with cold and fury. Widows got 4 children and no husband, and they took the one animal keeping them fed through winter, over a fee that didn't exist a year ago. I gave her what coin I had, but it isn't enough, Glasha. It's never enough. Voss bleeds this whole wood dry and Ashcombe does nothing because it doesn't touch his own table. Then it is time someone made it touch his table, Glasha said, quiet and dangerous, and Seth looked up at her with something between alarm and hope. What are you saying? I am saying my clan does not love Voss any better than your farmers do, Glasha said. His collectors have twice strayed past the old boundary stones chasing runaway debtors, and each time my clan has driven them back with arrows, though we have not yet gone to open war over it. If the humans of this wood rose against him organized, armed, ready, I believe the Ashwood clan might stand beside them rather than watch a tax warlord's cruelty spill over into our own hunting grounds. Seth stared at her. You'd fight beside us, against a human lord's tax collectors. I would fight beside you, Glasha said, correcting him without apology, closing the distance between them to rest her palm flat against his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her hand. That is no longer a question I have to weigh, Seth Sutton. Whether my clan joins is a different matter, and one I mean to put to Glasha Ironjaw myself, in person, rather than through some clean report scratched on hide that tells him nothing of what I have actually learned in this wood. You're going back to your war camp, Seth said slowly, understanding dawning, and something like fear flickered in his eyes despite himself. To tell them everything, about Voss, about the farms. He hesitated. About us, Glasha agreed, steady, though her own chest ached at the thought of what that confession might cost her among her own people. I have hidden this long enough, huntsman. Whatever comes of it, I would rather face my war chief's judgment honestly than keep hiding in your wood pretending I have not already chosen you over my duty. Seth's hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his chest, holding it there. And if they don't accept it? If your clan calls this a betrayal, then I will still have chosen you, Glasha said simply, and I have never once in my life regretted a choice made with a clear heart, even when it cost me everything else. She rose on her toes to press her forehead to his, an orc gesture of tenderness he had learned to treasure in the weeks since the river, since the first kiss, since he had stopped being merely a man she watched and become the man she loved. I go at first light. I will return before the next moon, Seth. I swear it on my mother's blade. He believed her. He had learned, in the months since an arrow missed his throat by the width of a coin, that Glasha Doomhammer did not make promises lightly, and did not break the one she made. She kept that promise, though not in the manner either of them expected, and not before disaster found the wood in her absence. Glasha Ironjaw's war camp occupied a wide hollow deep in the northern hills, hide tents arranged in careful defensive rings around a great central fire pit, smoke rising from cook fires into a sky bruised gray with coming snow. Glasha walked into that camp on the second day of her journey with her chin high and her purpose plain, and felt the weight of every eye that turned to track her passage, warriors and elders alike sensing, in the particular set of her shoulders, that their deadliest scout returned changed from the woman who had left. Glasha received her in his own tent, seated on a low bench of lashed logs, his heavy face unreadable in the lamp light as she laid out, without omission, everything she had learned and everything she had done, the tax warlord's cruelty, the huntsman's quiet resistance, the growing readiness of the frontier farms to rise if given cause and allies, and finally, because she would not lie to her war chief even by omission, her own heart, given freely and without regret to a human man named Seth Sutton. The tent went very still. You have not sent a single report in 3 months, Glasha said finally, voice a low rumble of controlled fury, because you were lying with a human in his bed instead of serving your clan. I was learning what my clan needed to know in the only way that yielded true answers, Glasha said, refusing to lower her eyes though her heart hammered. I have brought you more useful intelligence in this one telling than 100 cold reports scratched on hide could have carried. I know this wood's people, their fears, their loyalties, their breaking points, and I know them because I did not merely watch from a tree, I lived among them. And yes, War Chief, I love a human man, and I will not apologize for it, because it has cost my clan nothing and gained us the chance of an alliance that could spare us the very war you feared when you sent me. Glasha studied her a long, terrible moment, and around the fire outside Glasha could hear the low murmur of warriors who had gathered close enough to listen, drawn by the tension bleeding through the tent walls. Half this camp will call it betrayal, Glasha said at last. The other half will call it madness. I do not know yet what I call it. Call it what you like, Glasha said. But decide quickly, war chief, because while we speak, Voss's cruelty grows and the frontier farms grow more desperate, and desperate men make poor allies if left to face a tax warlord's blades alone. I would rather my clan stand with them by choice now than be dragged into their war later, on worse terms, after they have already been burned to nothing. It was Elder Vashka, oldest of the clan's council and the only one present who had fought in the last true war against human lords, a generation past, who finally broke the silence, rising stiffly from her place near the fire pit's edge. I remember the old treaty, Vashka said, her voice creaking like old leather. I remember when Ashwood blood and human blood ran in the same river along that border, and neither side gained anything but graves for it. If there is a way to avoid that river running red again, I would hear it before I dismiss the woman who found it, whatever bed she found it in. Gramash's jaw worked a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Bring your huntsman's message to the council fire tomorrow, Glasha Doomhammer, he said. We will hear what this woods people offer in exchange for our spears. But know this, if this is a trick, if this human warlord means to use you to lure us into a trap, the cost will fall on you before anyone else. It is no trick, Glasha said, relief and gratitude warring in her chest, and I would stake my own life on it gladly, war chief, because I already have. She should have returned to the wood that same night, flush with cautious hope, to bring Seth the news that her clan might yet stand beside him. She did not know, could not have known, standing in that fire-lit tent 3 days' hard travel from the frontier, that disaster had already found him in her absence, that kestrel Voss, growing impatient with a border wood that resisted his collectors more each week, had decided to make an example that would end all resistance at once. Seth Sutton was arrested on the 4th day of Glasha's absence, dragged from his own cabin at dawn by 6 of Voss's armed men on a charge invented as easily as any of the warlord's tax levies, harboring runaway debtors, aiding tenants against lawful collection, striking a king's collector in the course of his duty. It did not matter that the charges were half true and half fabricated. It mattered only that Voss wanted a lesson taught to the frontier wood, and a well-liked huntsman hanging in the market square of Harrow's Cross would teach it more thoroughly than a dozen burned barns. They marched him in chains through Milrow first, past the miller's daughter whose debt he had paid, past the widow Halloran whose cow he could not save, and every face that watched him pass wore the same helpless grief, men and women who owed him kindnesses they could not repay now with anything but useless tears. By the time they reached Harrow's Cross's market square, word had already spread through the frontier wood on foot and horseback faster than Voss's men could ride, and a crowd had begun to gather at the market square's edge, drawn by dread and disbelief. Farmers and tradesmen who had never once imagined they would see the quiet huntsman who paid their debts and mended their fences standing beneath a gallows beam. They built the gallows fast, crude and ugly, a single crossbeam raised on the square's central platform where Voss himself, a lean, cold-eyed man in fine black wool, stood to watch judgment carried out. Seth stood beneath the noose with his hands bound and his shirt torn from the rough handling of his captors, and if he was afraid, he did not let it show on his face, some last stubborn huntsman's pride keeping his chin level even as the rope was fitted rough around his neck. Let this be a lesson, Voss called out to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying cold and clear across the square, to any wood that thinks itself beyond the tax warlord's reach. This man harbored debtors, struck a lawful collector, defied the order that keeps this frontier civil. He hangs for it, and any who follow his example will hang beside him. The crowd's murmur turned ugly, frightened, helpless, farmers and villagers who wanted to surge forward and could not, faced with a dozen armed collectors ringing the platform with spears leveled outward. Somewhere in the press a woman was sobbing. Seth's eyes found the widow Halloran's face in the crowd, found the miller's daughter's, and felt a strange, terrible peace settle over him, even as the collector beside him reached for the lever that would drop the platform beneath his feet. It was in that exact breath, the collector's hand already closing on the lever, the crowd's collective gasp already rising, that an arrow took the collector through the wrist, and the lever fell useless from his shrieking grip. Glasha Doomhammer had ridden 3 days without rest, had arrived at the frontier wood's edge to find Seth's cabin empty and cold, and a trail of trampled snow leading toward Harrow's Cross, and had run the last 5 miles on foot faster than any horse could carry her, cutting through forest paths no cart road followed, arriving at the market square's outer edge just as the noose closed around the man she loved. She did not pause at the crowd's edge. She went through it, shoving startled townsfolk aside with brutal efficiency, bow already in hand, and the collectors ringing the platform barely had time to register an orc warrior tearing through a human crowd before her second arrow took a spearman through the thigh, and her own body was already vaulting the platform's low rail. Glasha! Seth's voice cracked with disbelief and desperate hope as she landed on the platform beside him, and she did not waste breath answering. She seized the noose rope in both hands and hauled it clean off his neck with a strength that made the remaining collectors stumble back a step, then spun with her skinning knife already drawn to cut the bindings at his wrists in 2 swift strokes. Voss, to his credit, did not flee, though his face had gone the color of old ash. "An orc," he said, voice pitched to carry, playing to whatever crowd might still fear her more than they hated him. "An orc dares set foot in Harrow's Cross to free a convicted." "Convicted of kindness," Glasha snarled, rounding on him with the same knife still bare in her hand, standing now between Voss's remaining collectors and Seth's unsteady body, her whole frame a wall of fury and leather and bared tusks that made even armed men take an instinctive step back. "Convicted of paying a widow's debt. Convicted of refusing to let your men starve children over invented fees. I have watched this wood for a season, tax warlord, and I have watched you bleed it dry while this man bled his own thin purse to keep it alive. You will not hang him for the crime of being better than you." The crowd's murmur had changed timbre entirely now, fear giving way to something bolder, and Glasha felt it shift beneath her like a current farmers who a moment ago cowered now finding their spines at the sight of an orc warrior willing to stand alone against Voss's collectors for a huntsman's sake, and beginning, here and there, to press forward rather than back. "Kill her!" Voss barked at his remaining men, voice cracking with fury and fear both. "Kill them both!" But the words had barely left his mouth when a horn sounded from the tree line beyond the town's low wall, long and low and unmistakably orcish, and a second horn answered it, and a third, and Voss's collectors turned to see a line of Ashwood clan warriors emerging from the forest's edge at a dead run, Gromesh Ironjoe himself at their head with his great warhammer already swinging loose in one fist, Elder Vashka's council having voted, in the end, exactly as Glasha had hoped, to answer a huntsman's cause with spears rather than let a border war find them on worse terms later. It was not a massacre. It did not need to be. The sight of 24 orc warriors pouring into a market town square that had never once seen orc feet cross its cobbles was enough, on its own, to break whatever remained of Voss's collectors' courage, and half of them threw down their weapons before a single blow was struck. Voss himself tried to run, and was seized by his own townsfolk, before he reached the square's edge men and women who had watched him bleed their frontier dry for a season, and needed only the smallest crack in his authority to remember their own courage. Seth, still unsteady from the rope's bruising grip and the shock of his own near death, found himself pulled bodily against Glasha's side as the square erupted into chaotic, disbelieving celebration around them, and he did not resist it, sagging gratefully into her strength, her arm like an iron band around his ribs holding him upright. "You came back," he managed, voice hoarse from the rope, disbelief and joy fighting for space in his chest. "I thought, Glasha, I thought I would never." "I told you I would return before the next moon," Glasha said fiercely, one hand coming up to cradle his jaw with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible from a woman who moments ago had been ready to gut a warlord barehanded, tusks bared, fury spent now into something raw and tender. I did not run 3 days and 5 miles on foot to arrive one breath too late, Seth Sutton. I told you I do not make promises lightly. You cut it close, he said, and felt a wet, helpless laugh escape him, half sob, and pressed his forehead to hers right there on the platform in full view of the entire gathered market square, orc and human alike, and did not care one whit who saw it. The Ashwood clan warriors, under Gramesh's grim command, secured Harrow's Cross's keep before the day was out, and Kestrel Voss found himself, by nightfall, bound in the very chains he had ordered fitted to a dozen debtors over the preceding season, awaiting judgment not from a court he had corrupted but from a gathered council of frontier farmers, orc elders, and arriving 2 days later once word reached his hunting lodge, a thoroughly shamed Lord Ashcombe, who found it considerably harder to remain indifferent to his tenants, suffering once an armed orc clan and half his own frontier populace stood united at his gate, demanding justice. Voss was stripped of his warlord seat and his ill-gotten wealth, most of which was returned to the farms he had bled, and marched south under Lord Ashcombe's own guard to face the Crown's justice for tax fraud and abuse of his collector's charter. A fate Seth privately thought too gentle, though Glasha, practical as ever, pointed out that a hanged man taught no lesson to the next fool who might try the same cruelty, while a warlord stripped of everything and marched off in chains, publicly and completely broken, taught every ambitious tax collector in the region exactly what price such cruelty carried. In the weeks that followed, the treaty between the Ashwood clan and the frontier's human settlements was renewed and widened, no longer a distant, half-forgotten boundary line 30 years unbroken, but a living agreement between neighbors who had, however unexpectedly, fought a common enemy together and found each other worth trusting. Gramesh Ironjaw, gruff and unconvinced as he remained about most matters concerning humans, could not deny that his clan's deadliest scout had brought them exactly what he had asked for: knowledge of whether the frontier's people would resist tyranny or bow to it, even if she had delivered it 3 months late, and wrapped around a human huntsman's heart rather than scratched onto cold hide. "You still owe me a proper report," Gramesh told her gruffly, the day the new treaty was signed beneath the boundary stones with elders and farmers alike as witness, snow falling soft and clean around them, the whole frontier wood hushed and bright with the season's first true storm having finally passed. "I have delivered it in full, War Chief," Glasha said, standing at Seth's side with her hand loosely claimed in his, no longer bothering to hide the gesture from anyone. "Every word of it true. I simply took longer to write it than most." Gramesh's mouth twitched, something almost like a smile buried in his heavy features. "Elder Vashka tells me there is a clan custom for this," he said, nodding toward the two of them with obvious reluctance to say the words plainly. "For a warrior who chooses a mate outside the clan, a marking. I do not fully understand why any of my scouts would choose a human for it, but I am told it is her right to ask if the human accepts." Seth looked at Glasha, questioning, and she turned to him with something more vulnerable in her yellow eyes than he had ever seen there, even in the market square with a knife still bare in her hand. "It is called the claiming mark," she said, quiet now, just for him despite the gathered witnesses. "A scar cut deliberately, here," she touched her own collarbone, just above the leather line of her cuirass, "and a matching mark given to the one claimed, so that any clan warrior who sees it knows the bearer belongs to another and is under that warrior's protection and devotion both, unbreakable. It is not required. Many orc pairings do not bother with it, but I find, Seth Sutton, that I do not wish to simply love you quietly in a cabin at the wood's edge for the rest of our years. I wish every warrior of my clan and every soul in this frontier to know plainly that you are mine, chosen, claimed, and I will meet any question about it with a blade if I must." "Then mark me," Seth said, without a single second's hesitation, something fierce and glad breaking open across his weathered face, and I'll wear it prouder than anything I've owned in my whole life. The claiming took place that same evening, not in secret, but before the boundary stones themselves. Orc and human witnesses gathered in a loose circle beneath torches driven into the snow, while Elder Vashka spoke the old words of the rite in the clan's own tongue and Glasha drew her skinning knife, the same one she had used to cut Seth's bindings on the gallows platform, across her own collarbone in a single clean line. And then, with a tenderness that made more than one hardened warrior in that circle shift uncomfortably at the sight of such softness in their deadliest scout, drew a matching mark low on Seth's shoulder where his shirt fell open, sealing it with a strip of cloth and a murmured clan blessing that needed no translation for anyone watching to understand its meaning. "Mine," Glasha said afterward simply, pressing her palm flat over the fresh mark on his shoulder, torchlight gold in her yellow eyes, snow falling soft around them both. "Yours," Seth agreed, and kissed her there before the boundary stones with the whole gathered wood as witness, no longer caring, no longer needing to care, what any prejudice old or new might whisper about an orc scout and a human huntsman choosing each other in the open instead of hiding it in shadow. Winter deepened after that, but it was, for the first time in Seth's memory, a warm one, in every way that mattered. Glasha did not return to the war camp to live, though she traveled back often enough to keep faith with her clan and to see Gramash's gruff, unwilling fondness for her deepen into something like actual respect once he saw, on his own visits to the frontier wood, the plain devotion between his former scout and her chosen human. She made the cabin at the woods edge her home instead, though she never once stopped being a warrior. She kept her bow strung by the door and her leathers ready, and more than one traveling merchant or wary Milrow villager learned quickly enough that the huntsman's mate was not a woman to be trifled with ever, under any circumstance, and that the frontier wood under her watch had never been safer. Seth, for his part, found that being loved so fiercely, so openly, by a woman who could have chosen any warrior in her own clan and had chosen him instead, changed something fundamental in how he carried himself through the world. The lonely huntsman who had once sat by his fire most nights with no company but his own thoughts found himself, that following spring, laughing more easily, standing straighter, meeting the world with a confidence that had nothing to do with skill at trapping or archery, and everything to do with the simple, bone-deep knowledge that somewhere close by, a woman fiercer and more magnificent than he had ever imagined possible had looked at his whole ordinary, hard-working, overlooked life and decided, without hesitation, that it was worth staying for. The frontier would healed slowly under the new treaty's protection, farms rebuilding what Voss's cruelty had broken, the boundary stones between clan and settlement no longer a line of old suspicion, but a marker of something closer to kinship. Milrose Miller's daughter married a young farmhand that spring and asked shyly if the huntsman and his orc lady might stand as witnesses, which they did, Glasha startling the whole gathered wedding party by weeping, quiet and fierce, at the sight of two young people choosing each other so plainly, so unafraid, in a way that echoed her own choice made across an impossible boundary. One evening in early spring, nearly a full year after an arrow had missed Seth Sutton's throat by the width of a coin, he found Glasha sitting on the flat stone at the river ford where they had first truly spoken to each other, the willow weir long since repaired and full of fat spring fish, the water running high and clean with the melt. "You are thinking too loud," Glasha said without turning, feeling him approach the way she always did, some hunter's instinct in her that had never fully switched off even in a year of peace. "Sit. Tell me what troubles you." "Nothing troubles me," Seth said, settling beside her on the stone, close enough now that their shoulders pressed together without either of them thinking twice about the distance. "I was only remembering. This is where you first sat down across from me instead of watching from the trees." "I remember," Glasha said, and there was warmth in it, old fondness worn smooth as river stone itself. I nearly did not. I told myself that morning that I would make contact once more only to be certain my judgment had not gone soft, and then decide whether to keep watching you or return to my war camp and forget I had ever found you worth more than a report. What changed your mind? Glasha turned to look at him fully, the last of the spring sun gold across the strong green plains of her face, the claiming mark faint but permanent at her collarbone, and something in her yellow eyes held all the fierce, unguarded devotion of a woman who had once been feared across 100 miles of frontier for her deadly skill, and had found, in the end, that the truest use of that skill was standing between the man she loved and every danger the world could throw at him. You looked at me, she said simply, not as a thing to fear, nor a thing to conquer, nor even simply a thing to be grateful toward for saving your life. You looked at me as though I were already exactly what you had been waiting for, alone in this wood without knowing it. No man had ever looked at me that way before, Seth Sutton. I did not know until that look how badly I had wanted someone to. Seth reached for her hand, the way he had that first night by the fire, and felt her fingers thread through his without hesitation, easy now as breathing, a year of devotion worn smooth between them. I'll keep looking at you that way, he said. Every day I've got left to look at anything at all. See that you do, Glasha said, fierce and warm both, and leaned in to kiss him there on the flat stone at the river's edge, the water running clean and bright past them both, the whole healed frontier wood settling into the long, easy peace of a season finally, truly won. They stayed there until the sun went down fully behind the black pines, the first stars pricking through a sky no longer bruised with warlord smoke or gallows dread, and when they finally rose to walk the familiar path back to the cabin at the wood's edge, they walked it together, hand in hand, an orc scout who had stopped reporting back because she had found, at the edge of an enemy's territory, something worth more than any report she could have written, and the lonely huntsman who had stopped being lonely the day her arrow found its mark and had never once looked back since. The cabin waited for them warm and lit, smoke curling soft from the chimney into the clean spring night, and neither of them said much more as they climbed the porch steps together, because there was nothing left, in that quiet, hard-won hour, that needed saying aloud. Everything that mattered between them had already been spoken, in an arrow loosed to save a stranger's life, in a report never sent, in a rope cut clean on a gallows platform, in a mark carried on skin and worn like the proudest thing either of them owned. Dawn found them there still, tangled together beneath a worn quilt as gray light crept soft through the shutters, the fire banked low to embers, the whole frontier wood outside hushed and new with the season's first true warmth. Glasha woke first, as she always did, some old scout's habit refusing to fully rest even in peace, and lay still a long moment simply watching Seth sleep beside her, his face open and unguarded in a way she had learned only she was ever allowed to see, the claiming mark on his shoulder pale in the early light, his hand still loosely curled around hers even in sleep as though some part of him feared, even now, that she might vanish back into the trees if he let go. She did not vanish. She pressed her lips soft to the mark on his shoulder instead, and felt him stir and wake beneath the gesture, his eyes opening slow and warm to find her there, exactly where she had been every morning since the day she stopped watching from a distance and chose instead to stay. "Morning," he murmured, voice rough with sleep, and pulled her closer against him beneath the quilt as the first honest sunlight of the day broke gold across the cabin floor. "Morning, huntsman," Glasha said, settling into the curve of him with a contentment she had never once thought herself capable of feeling, deadliest scout of the Ashwood clan, finally, fully, unshakably home. "I told you once that you did not yet know what you owed me." "I remember," Seth said, smiling against her hair. "I have decided the debt is paid," Glasha said, "in full, and more besides." Outside, the frontier wood woke slow and gentle into the new day. The boundary stone standing quiet witness under new spring green, the market town of Harrow's Cross rebuilding under fairer hands, the whole hard, rugged, healing country settling into a peace neither clan nor crown had thought possible a year before. And in the small cabin at the wood's edge, the only two people in all that wide country who mattered to each other in that quiet hour lay tangled together in the gold morning light. The storm long past, nothing left standing between them any more but each other, and neither one of them wanting it any other way.